So let's talk about why all this matters. So David Plouffe was the campaign manager for Barack Obama. And I'll never get you to go listen to this podcast, so I'm going to play some portions and we'll talk about it. It's a great conversation with a reporter named Bart Gellman, who wrote an excellent piece in The Atlantic. It's the cover story. It is a must-read. It's printed. It's 21 pages, so it's a long article by Barton Gellman, The Election That Could Break America. And so why does all this matter, right? So the Republicans, I'm sure these people that they think, some of them think they're doing the noble thing. Others know that they're employing a strategy to help the president win. Well, all right. I want to preface this by saying I don't know if this, I want to posit this because it could happen. And if it does, I want you to have some context before it happens. I'm not saying that it will happen, right? So I think sometimes with Trump, people take the extreme, and then you go watch the video and he's joking, right? Like, there's some outrageous things like saying the Marshals it was an extrajudicial killing on that American citizen by the U.S. Marshals. That stuff he's not kidding about. But then, like, I'm going to go with the crowd and kiss all of you. Like, that stuff's funny. Like, that's funny, yeah. Trump, right? But then you read the New York Times the next day and it's like, he's going to kiss people with COVID, but when you have this much organization around a concept, you have to take it seriously and you have to understand. But do I think that Donald Trump is employing a strategy to steal the election using legal tactics? I think he's trying to win the election and this is his plan B. But the plan B is there until we need to take a look at it. Now, if it's a Biden landslide, this is probably not going to happen. But I think use your thinking cap. Donald Trump is not going to go quietly. So what would that look like? And I can sit here and read to you more, but I was going to read more. So I want to play you some segments from this podcast with the author of that Atlantic article who did a ton of reporting around this strategy that we talked about today, none of which in our show notes that we just read you came from this article. It's separate from separate sources. There's just so much evidence here that this is taking place that you can have a 21-page article and still have a 17-page of show notes and not have the information cross. But what's the point of it, right? What is the goal of doing this? And I can sit here and read to you some more, but I want to play Gellman's explanation of it after doing all this reporting and putting all of this stuff together into a thread. And it's from a podcast called Campaign HQ with David Plouffe. Again, his campaign manager, Barack Obama's campaign manager. And this show combined with Hacks on Tap from the Obama, Romney, McCain campaign managers, you get a lot of insight at presidential politics as to how they think about it and how it works on that level. And so they're very interesting shows. And they don't talk a lot about politics. They talk a lot about procedure, which is why this is an interesting listen. So this is from the, and let me just put this up there to give full credit because we're going to play a chunk of this so you know where it's from. So you can go and check it out. So the next voice you hear is David Plouffe.
And I want to start with the 12th Amendment. So maybe most people listening have some view of what the 12th Amendment is, but talk about the 12th Amendment and why it's important for us to understand what it is in the context of this election.
The 12th Amendment tells you how the president is selected, how the vote is counted. And it is unfamiliar, I think, to a lot of Americans because we don't have to bother knowing about it. There are a series of important milestones that take place between Election Day and Inauguration Day. It's a 79-day period that I call the interregnum in my article in The Atlantic. And those are actually the way the president gets selected by our Constitution. It's just that they're normally formalities. 12th Amendment says that on January 6th, the president of the Senate, in particular, Mike Pence, in the presence of the Senate and the House, so it's a joint meeting, shall open the certificates, which are the certificates that are that tell you what each state's electoral votes were cast, and the ballots shall then be counted. Passive voice. And the problem with the passive voice there is that you don't know how the count proceeds if the count is contested, and in particular, if in any of the important states there is controversy about who are the electors whose votes get to count, then you've got Congress left to solve that problem, and the Constitution is silent on how.
Right. So, Bart, you really are clear in the piece that, of course, if there's a Biden landslide and he were to be declared the winner that night, a lot of the parade of horribles you mentioned that may take place in an interregnum won't take place. But let's talk about, so that would be great. And my view, well, I'd like to know your view on this. So let's say we don't know on November 3rd, but it's pretty clear from the votes that have been counted that it's going to be a Biden win of some significance. It takes, maybe November 5th or November 6th. In that scenario, do you think all of the fuel is taken out of the Trump effort to steal the election?
I'd say a lot of fuel is taken out, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. I take as a premise of my article, and I'm prepared to defend it, that there is no circumstance under which Donald Trump will concede defeat in the election.
I agree with that.
That his only answer is going to be that if he's not ahead in the count, then the count is fraudulent. And then the question is just, what does he have he can do about it? How much can he do about it under various circumstances? What are his constraints and what are his opportunities? And if he is leading on the election night count in an important state, but we happen to know that there are still 2 million votes left to be counted in that state.
Like most of the votes, yes, right.
Right. I mean, and we know because of a phenomenon called the blue shift that the overtime count is likely to trend in the direction of Biden. That's been true for 20 years now, the blue shift. Then election commentators are going to say, well, Trump is ahead so far. There are 2 million votes left to be counted, and projections suggest that Biden will do well in that group. Trump will call the count that night. He'll say, that's it. The only count that counts is votes that were enumerated and tabulated on election night. Everything else is a fraudulent attempt to take my victory away. I think that even if Biden has a significant lead, he will do what he can do to collect all the inevitable stories, and there always are stories of screw-ups around the country where some votes got damaged in a plumbing leak, or something got lost, something got found. There are discrepancies always in an election. This is an election administered in 10,500 jurisdictions around the country, mostly counties. There's going to be little episodes that can be blown up on social media and that the president can point to and claim represent large-scale fraud, just as he's already done with this trivial incident in Pennsylvania in which 9 votes were accidentally placed in a trash can. So he will do his best. And the question is whether, for example, the Republican Party will go along with him in his narrative of massive fraud.
Right.
If he can throw up enough fog, then I wouldn't rule out a controversy that lasts a while. I mean, concession is the way we end elections in America. That's how it happens. The losing candidate says, I accept that the winner has legitimately the win has legitimately gone to the other side. That's how every election has ended. And if you don't have that, it's very hard to replace it.
So the fog is the key. And that's sort of how he operates across the board, is the fog and the, is Hunter Biden and China and Russia and the emails and the Rudy stuff and is the perfect phone call and, is Vindman good or bad? Like, that's sort of the fog is how he operates and how he kind of, and he's not, this is just how that mentality, if I can, a narcissist will generally keep you off balance, keep you anxious, keep you guessing, keep you questioning yourself, telling you his version of reality, forcing you to believe it by bullying you. Like the lawsuits are to create fog, so you can't keep up. So you can't keep track of what all you see is just the multiple lawsuits and the ballots and the Republicans are suing here, and you're kind of lean towards the Republican Party, so you're kind of glad that those people are suing over that, and you never really question it. And so it just seems, well, if they're suing, they must be suing for a reason. They're not suing for no reason whatsoever. There must be some purpose to it. The purpose is to create the confusion, to allow you to have the ability to operate in whatever shady manner you want. Donald Trump is, this Trump University thing. They started with the Russia stuff. And so I can't trust anything that they're saying, but then you go and look at the tax returns. You look at the revenue that the Trump campaign is bringing in on a consistent basis from their properties using the Republican Party and the White House Travel Office and the Secret Service as guaranteed room nights. You don't pay attention to that because you just go, that person who's bringing you that information is not trustworthy because they work for the New York Times or the Atlantic. I can't trust this because that person has Trump derangement syndrome. They just talk about how bad he is. Right. I don't want to pay attention to this because it's just too much. It's too overwhelming. And so that fog, that exhaustion, that constant churning he plays off of that to operate in ways that are shady. And then the only solution is for the Republican Party to turn and say, stop this. This is not how we behave. And then you go, well, that's just when George Bush and John McCain and Mitt Romney, they're just the deep state, and they're all sticking together. James Carville, writing for the Republican website The Bulwark, it is just the deep state sticking together. David Axelrod doing a podcast with Mike what's his face from the Romney campaign. That's just the deep state sticking together. And yeah, there is camaraderie amongst thieves. Like, that does exist. And I will tell you that some of my best friends in politics are Republicans and Democrats who served for political parties, because I have an experience that they have and nobody else understands it. When you run a state political party, you feel a kinship to the other people who did that too, because you know what it's like. And then when you talk about it and you're in pictures with those Republican Democratic friends, the elites are all just sticking together. Meanwhile, I'm living in an 800 square foot apartment. You know what I mean? So
yes,
that constant fog is how he operates, but it's the in-group policing that will keep them in check. It's one of the reasons I love that Rimzo's voting for Trump and Ryan is voting for Biden, and they're contributors to the We Are Libertarians Facebook page in this network, because their perspectives are going to keep me from going too far one way or the other. I have to debate Rhinehold, who's really smart, and Ryan, who is really smart, and Brian and Rimzo, who are really smart, and Harry.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I didn't say you were very smart, but I hope the joke came through. You know what I mean? Like, those differing perspectives as a form of in-group policing to keep us all kind of tethered to reality, because when we here in Indiana go, you guys don't realize what a problem these white supremacist militias are. They're fucking scary and they're really bad. And then the person who's living in the East Coast city goes, you don't understand how bad Antifa is though. And you have a tendency to talk past each other and go, like, it's not about a team, right? Like, my experience here in the Midwest is different, like where we didn't have the kind of lockdowns LA has.
Correct.
So when I talk to my friends over at Lions of Liberty who live in LA, they're very concerned with mask mandates and government intervention in that. But when you talk to Indiana libertarians, they're very concerned with the people they're rubbing shoulders with at a lot of these events or online, who are in these like 3%er type groups and seeing the radicalization that's taking place.
Right.
It doesn't mean either is right or wrong. It's not a choice. It's just that having those conversations keeps everybody kind of balanced. And when the Republic, Harry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, like, the difference of like your entire worldview, like where you're concentrating in that, and that's another reason why, like, libertarians just try to get power away from the federal government, because they're not seeing the small local issues that everyone else is having. So yeah, if you're I get brought into California stuff because I have to deal with people at work, and I just have to tell them, like, well, just go do that. Like, well, I can't go to the office. What do you mean you can't go to the office? I go to the office all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're locked down. You know, you can't leave.
Yeah, they have a totally different experience there than we've had in Indiana. Like we had lockdowns for 2 weeks, but it wasn't. The government here can't do anything because they haven't been building a power base with the rapidity of California.
Correct.
One of these East Coast blue states. So when Brian Nichols goes, what do you mean Antifa is not real? Like I have gunshots in my neighborhood and the Lowe's got ransacked and it wasn't by white supremacists. It was by Antifa or, so I'm sympathetic to that. It's just like we all try to force each other into different camps instead of going like, oh, thank you for your perspective. That really helps. I'm concerned with this thing over here because you and I can go to the office.
Right.
Like, the government here can't do anything because it's a fairly free state comparatively.
Comparatively, yeah.
You look at Whitmer and you just go, oof.
Yeah, because right now, Indianapolis, their police department is strapped dealing with a crime, a violent rate that they are not equipped for and have no and it's the perfect storm, and it's the reason why Indy is having its this violent crime, and no one wants to address it, the cost of it, but it's there. But so all the mandates from like the COVID stuff is also coming from the health department, know, and snitches.
Yeah,
people snitching on other people. I think that's what you see in Indy is the like people getting snitched on to the health department. And
you will not face there. And every police agency in the rural areas of Indiana, when Holcomb put out the mask mandate, put out statements saying, we have better things to do. We will not enforce this.
Right.
And, when you look at what's going on in LA or California, where like literally they just put out a curfew and you can't have more than 4 people over to your house and you can't sing while you're in the presence of each other. You just go, what is happening over there? Because it's just so different. But my point, I don't want to get lost because we're going on a tangent. My point is that when there isn't that kind of in-group policing or conversation, because we just kind of stick with what we know, it allows for a greater slide towards craziness. And the problem that I have with a lot of, I get that Donald Trump is Donald Trump. We get that, right?
Yes.
But what happened to Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul and some of these other people? And you're just like, or Ben Sass, who I have a ton of respect for Ben Sass. And then he quietly says under his breath on a conference call that he kisses butts of white supremacists and he does all these bad things. But dude, in the primary, you were kissing his ass to get through your primary. Like, again, no honor amongst thieves. Right. And so, I read an article in the Atlantic last night. Where's George W. Bush? Why isn't he's the only Republican president, and he's not speaking out against him, and he's just enjoying his summer at Kennebunkport while the nation burns? And how has he let democracy down? And I'm just like thinking, this magazine in the 2000s thought this man was the devil, and now he's the only one that can save democracy. So funny to me.
Yep.
But
he's gonna save it.
But there is a point when we get to the third part of this interview that I want to play where, you're going to need some of these Republicans to grow a backbone and actually stand up and say, this isn't how America does things.
Correct.
So
what everyone wanted Rand to do.
Exactly. So let's continue with this conversation with Bart Gellman of The Atlantic on the Campaign HQ podcast with David Plouffe.
No, for sure. So I want to focus on, before we get to a scenario that is, this thing is a lot closer than the polls suggest. It may take weeks to decide the president in the actual vote count. That, I think, is the most damaging situation for the country. But let's focus on one where, Biden's not declared the winner election night, but maybe he's won Florida, or Florida's super close. There's still going to be some votes to count. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina. All the expert analysis, including, the Fox boiler room, is saying Biden's going to win. But Trump goes out and says, I'm ahead, I've won. All the rest of the votes are fraudulent. In both your reporting for your piece, Bart, and I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people afterwards, what's your view of what the Republican Party does? So the McConnells of the world, other senators, governors, do they go along with Trump in that scenario, or do they counsel patience and say we've got to wait for all the votes to be counted?
That's such an important question, and I really don't know. But here's something to understand about the genius of Donald Trump, and I think he does have a genius, and that is for suborning people to induce them to cross lines they never imagined that they would cross.
For sure.
By sticking them into a sort of a gray area first and gradually dragging them over the line into something they just can't believe that they're saying. And the problem is, if you asked the mainstream Republicans whether they would try to discredit the results of an election when the count was clear, they would certainly say no. They would never do such a thing. But they are already bought into a narrative of fraud. They are already going along with the idea that that mail-in votes have potential for fraud. You saw in 2018 when the overtime count changed results in California and in Arizona and in Florida, that you had mainstream Republicans like Paul Ryan saying, well, these votes are coming out of nowhere. We have no idea how this is happening. Right. As if there was something suspicious about keeping on counting when the vote count is unfinished. And I'm afraid that they will be lured far enough across the line of a narrative on voter fraud that they'll keep going when he does. He'll make it hard to get off that train.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's going to be maybe the most profound test these elected officials have ever had in their life, and I'm a little bit scared about what's going to happen there. So
in this Atlantic article about the Bushes, they all said, the reason Jeb and George are staying silent despite their very clear disrespect and dislike of Trump is George P. Bush, Jeb's son, wants to have a political future. If you're looking for courage from the political class, you are mistaken. And if you're looking for them to save democracy from themselves, they're not going to do it. They're really politicians, as it is a bedrock principle of We Are Libertarians. Politicians are spineless weasels, and you can always expect them to do what the crowd wants, and the crowd usually wants what's wrong. And they want to be lied to. They want to be, and so politicians like Mitch McConnell are probably going to go along with whatever scheme if it's close, and you really don't. And so he's going to get into more technical stuff here in just a moment. But I wanted to just stop and make the point, don't expect the Republican Party to stand up and do the right thing. They're going to play into the fog because that's what we've seen them do for 5 years. Rudy Giuliani's telling the truth. Let's go to bat. It doesn't matter how shaky this information is or how weird the witness was and how many times the guy changed his story on, never mind the fact that who just drops 3 laptops off at a repair shop and just doesn't go pick them up? Is it out of the realm of possibility that go ahead, Harry, you said that's common? That's
common. People do that to cars. People go to cars or they get the bill hey, you need to fix these. And they don't want to pay. You got
pictures of you with a crack pipe or a meth pipe. You don't go pick that laptop up?
All right. So I've had people drop off laptops to me to fix, and I told them how much it is to fix and what it is like that. Then they go, all right, whatever, keep it. And there's tons of info of their stuff on it. I do the right thing and just erase it, but
fair enough.
They leave. Yeah.
I suppose you think it was the Russians, Rhinehold.
I don't want to get it too far in down that little
we're way
rabbit hole.
Well over
2 hours, and I know we don't have that time. But my whole thing on this is that Trump doesn't care about the Republican Party. He cares about to throw the party under the bus to stay in power. And Republican parties at some point are going to have to say, we need to protect ourselves because this is this guy's not going to be around forever. So they may, in a preservational moment, decide that we need to stop this because
I'm amazed at how bad the Senate is going, and if they really believe court packing and Puerto Rico and the filibuster, all these things that they're freaking out about, if the liberals get control of the Senate, why wouldn't you throw the thing that is keeping you from winning the Senate under the bus and start fundraising? Because you're having to play in South Carolina and these seats that weren't supposed to be up. And here's the truth that you guys need to hear about the next Senate if it's Democratic. The thing about the 2018 class of Democrats and the thing about the 2020 class of Democrats in the House and Senate is they're not the squad. You know, the guy winning in Arizona, the Christina Hale here in Indiana is a conservative Democrat who's probably going to beat Victoria Sparks, a far right Republican.
Yeah,
you know, and you know the guy winning, like Doug Jones. Think Doug Jones in Alabama. These are not flame-throwing squad, I'm going to vote for the Green New Deal type Democrats. Neither is Joe Biden. Joe Biden was once called the Republicans' favorite Democratic senator because he was the guy that reliably worked to pass conservative legislation like these crime bills we all talk about. So while the mistake that the Democrats and liberals are going to make is that they are going to pretend that Twitter is the real world like they always do, and they're going to reach too far. And then the Democratic conservative senators from Iowa, you know, Indiana had one named Joe Donnelly, and he was basically a pro-life Republican. The progressives in the state hated him. Iowa, Alabama, Colorado, Arizona, all these, you know, North Carolina, if he wins, these people are not going to vote for all this big liberal Twitter plays well on Twitter stuff. And so they're going to have the cold reality for the liberals if they win the Senate, win the White House, is it's a fight for generational power. And so, you know, the Republicans, I'm just mystified why maybe that's why they're hedging their bets and going with Trump in case 2016 miracle win comes about again. Why they didn't just throw him under the bus and why they always just continually make excuses for this guy, because he's willing to take this entire party down. You've got a guy in Arkansas who's running against Tom Cotton, who did an amazing job in his Senate town hall, basically, who has a shot. You've got Don Rainwater running for governor in Indiana on the Libertarian ticket, and he's got a shot. You guys are really going to be a second, third party in the Republican Party if you don't keep it up because of demographics. So, all right, let's go ahead. Any thoughts before we move on? Okay. So there is a procedural. I gave you half a second, Harry.
No, I'm just no. I know you gave me that. It was just more just like I want to go onto it, but it will just derail it. So just keep going. Go.
I have a radio.
We can go till 8 p.m. if you want to go. Let's do this. Let's get on a 10-hour podcast and let's just get this done.
No. I have Gunther banging this door down because she knows after I'm done with this, we go to park.
This is just a 40-minute clip that I'm going to play. So this is a longer clip, and then we'll be done. So, anyways, we're laying out a case, boys. All right, we're laying out evidence so people understand what's going on here. This is fascinating information, but I saved this for the end because the people listening this far really do care about this. But this is about what would happen. So talked a little bit about the day after election, the beginning of it, why there's all this stuff going on, creating the fog, saying it's the rigged vote. It's all going to be all this. So you can then, if it is close, get some shenanigans going. This section of the podcast is about what happens with the electors and how Trump would use, what legal mechanisms he would use to try and become president in that instance.
So, Bart, let's say that, and, you know, this is a scenario I think you center on in your piece, that the votes are counted and Joe Biden has surpassed 270 electoral votes. You know, one of the things you capture in the piece is, you know, this is not just idle musings. The Trump campaign is actively considering, maybe they're already doing it, you know, organizing rival slates of electors. So essentially you'd have particularly where you have Republicans in control of state legislatures in some of these battlegrounds, you would have coming up two rival states slates of electors that ultimately make their way to Congress. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that would happen and what that would mean?
Right. Even insiders sometimes don't realize that electors are actually human beings.
Right.
There's 538 of them, and they each get one vote. And the slates of electors are pre-committed, either to Biden or to Trump. And so the question is whether a state legislature in a state like Pennsylvania, which is a battleground state where the legislature is controlled by Republicans, would try to maneuver around the appointment of electors in the usual way, which is by the popular vote in that state, and instead seek to name electors, name the Trump electors regardless of the voting outcome. Now, the Constitution says that each state legislature may choose electors in the manner of its own choosing. It's only by tradition and by state legislation that electors are chosen by popular vote. But the argument would be the popular vote is hopelessly poisoned by fraud. The count has been rigged. We can't trust the certified results, and we're going to have to decide for ourselves, we Republicans, who we think the people intended to vote for, and we're going to certify the Trump electors as representing Pennsylvania's results, regardless what the popular vote count says or doesn't say. And this is something that Republicans actually went almost all the way to doing in Florida in the year 2000. The day that Gore came out to concede the election, which was the day after the Supreme Court ruled in Bush against Gore, both chambers of the Republican Florida legislature had passed out of committee a resolution that would have appointed Republican electors regardless of the standing of the ongoing litigation about the recount. And they were prepared to vote for it on December 13th and would have passed it. But Gore came out and obviated the need for that. So it's a move that is known to them and that I know the Trump campaign is talking about. I can't say what it's planning.
So you mentioned Pennsylvania, the state legislature there is controlled by Republicans, but there's a Democratic governor. What role will governors have in this process, if any?
Well, it's an important role. Here, I'm just working through the logic of the position they would take and the power that they have. So suppose that Pennsylvania's legislature says, the count is bollocks, we're appointing Trump electors. The governor would then say, I'm certifying the results of the count. And in this scenario, we've got Biden ahead. And so I am certifying the Biden electors. Both of them send those votes, they're called certificates of ascertainment, to the National Archives and to the President of the Senate, Mike Pence. And now they have to do that by December 8th, which is the so-called safe harbor deadline for a state to choose its electors. But because there is a controversy, because the electors are not consensus electors, because they're now 40 people claiming the right to cast the 20 votes for Pennsylvania, Congress has to decide what to do with them. Does it count the votes? Which votes does it count? And Mike Pence is presiding over the joint session of Congress that has to make that decision.
And that would be the current Congress, as opposed to changes as a result of this election, correct?
No, actually, it would be the new Congress. Would be the new Congress.
Okay.
The new Congress is seated on January 3rd.
Sorry, I was back in December. So, right. So this is right after the January 3rd installation of the new Congress.
Right. On January 6th is when Congress takes up the votes that the Electoral College cast. So there's a 3-week period that passes after the Electoral College. And the Electoral College in this scenario has had a meltdown. You have had multiple delegations showing up and purporting to cast the votes of Pennsylvania in this scenario. And Congress has to try to make some sense of it.
Okay, so yeah, in that 3-year period, we go from the state capitals to the United States Capitol. So, and you captured this in your piece, but it's worth reminding people that if the Democrats do take back the Senate and hold the House, whatever Trump does out in the states is going to reach a brick wall in Washington in early January, correct?
Yes, with an asterisk, because there's always an asterisk in law, and there's always an asterisk with Trump. So I mentioned earlier that the 12th Amendment of the Constitution does not tell you how the count is to proceed. It's in passive voice. So what happens if you've been given 2 conflicting certificates to count? Congress tried to answer that question after a horrible meltdown in 1876. Some years later, Congress passed the Electoral Account Act, which attempted to instruct Congress about how to decide which electoral votes will count. The problem is it's one of the worst written, most opaque pieces of legislation that exist in the U.S. Code. It is almost impossible to understand the instructions, and there's sort of a logic bomb in there in which it could mean opposite things under certain scenarios. And so if you have Democrats in control of the Senate and in control of the House, then both chambers would vote to accept the electors, presumably, that representing Biden from Pennsylvania. But because the 12th Amendment says that Mike Pence presides over this count, it would be the position of the Trump campaign that Pence had the unilateral authority to rule on his own reelection and Trump's, and that Pence's vote was the only one that counted in deciding which electors to recognize. They would be saying in effect that the Electoral Account Act is unconstitutional if it conflicts with that reading. And so there would still be, now if the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans would go along with this, then there would still be a controversy, and it might fall to the Supreme Court. It also might fall to the power of the president to declare insurrection and enforce Pence's judgment that he'd been reelected.
Woo! So I bet people, because we just take for granted that all this stuff. I have been a presidential elector. I was selected by my party to serve as a Libertarian Party elector should Gary Johnson win in 12 or 16. Yeah, 2012. I think it was just 2012. But regular people are electors, and so you hear but you just kind of take for granted that there is just, you vote on election day, that we all select the president, and then you move on, right? None of us are old enough, except for Rhinehold, to remember the 2000 election. I know this sounds weird, but Chuck Todd has a good podcast out right now called Florida, and his Chuck Toddcast, which is the most beta name for a podcast ever, but it actually is a really good 5-part audio documentary on the 2000 recount. So I would recommend checking that out. But a lot of us take for granted all the legal loopholes that kind of go into what we just heard. Now, to extend this, all of this is game theory. All this is just playing it out, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen on election day. It could be a Trump blowout. It could be a Biden blowout. It could be a 2016 with Biden losing the Electoral College with winning the popular vote. It could be Trump losing in a squeaker, going through with all this stuff. Not saying any of this is the reality and that this is what's going to happen. I want to be very clear about that. I don't want anybody to be scared about all this stuff, because this is all just game theory, right? We're working out what may happen, trying to give you some information so you understand what happens. So Trump declares insurrection. So let me pick it up there, as I wrote in an article about how we could slip into civil war. Through this, you now have 2 decided factions that have said one of the other is the rightful president and the heir apparent to take over the Constitution. The majority of the government, the state, local, federal governments go with Joe Biden, right? The majority stick with him. Mm-hmm. But there's a percentage of the country that goes with Donald Trump and recognizes him as the rightful president. And it's all the militias, all the people with the guns, the very well armed. It's 10 to 20% of local police departments, state police, the military. They all side together. Tensions get hot. You get a Rittenhouse event. that the Kyle Rittenhouse event is a very localized event that takes place in one small geographic area. What happens when that tension and that escalation expands to the entire country through a process like this, and people feel that they are forced into two sides, and then you have 2% of the country that is then engaged in armed conflict? So when people talk about civil war, that is what they're talking about, because now all of a sudden you've got skirmishes taking place in cities on behalf of the Back the Blue, and the other side is the BLM, but Team Biden versus Team Trump. And your local police department, because of the defections and the firepower of local citizens that are willing to engage in violent acts, they're equally armed. So, that is that is the most likely scenario in terms of how you'd slip into a civil war. Now, do I think that's going to happen? I don't. I think that I don't buy the civil war talk, because I think more than anything, Americans love comfort, and the idea of hardship brought on by a civil war is just not going to happen. You'd have some skirmishes here and there, like a Rittenhouse event, but it doesn't go full. Like, I don't buy it, but I wanted to posit that because that's a very natural, but that constitutional crisis of two presidents without the violence is possible. That could happen. So again, it's just kind of gaming all this out, and it has to be on the table and understood, because the Republican Party and the Trump campaign are trying to force this. So, but in the fog, everybody's going to go, well, they'll, the problem is that everybody, like the Kyle Rittenhouse events, there's 10 layers to that. There's 200 layers to what we just laid out in the last 2.5 hours. But when it's going on and it's happening, you're in the middle of it, in the fog of it, everybody's arguing, and you're the hardcore libertarian who listens to only the right-wing media and Ben Shapiro and the New York Post and the Washington Examiner, and that's where they get their news. And then your liberal friend who only reads Vox and the Washington Post, and everybody's got two sets of information and facts, and they're both kind of right, but it's never merged together. And so if we get to this point, if we have that sort of thing, I want you to understand what could happen, how it would work. And so that way, if we get to that point and it is somewhat of a contested election, you are better prepared to understand what's going on. And I appreciate everybody kind of being patient with some of that, because I think it's just hugely, hugely important to understand the legal mechanisms that are taking place. Your thoughts, Rhinehold or Harry?
Bigly thoughts, if you would. Yeah, it's that I get with you with the whole comfort thing. I don't really buy too much also into the Civil War talk. It's fun to joke about and even make memes on, but no, Americans are way too comfortable in their areas. Will there maybe some riots and some scrimmages in some areas? Yeah. Oh yeah. That's probably going to happen. But
there was a great podcast by Andrew Heaton. Political Orphanage is a great podcast. Libertarian centrist Andrew Heaton did a podcast, the last one, about there will be a revolution after this election day based on one of these two candidates winning or losing. And he said it's not going to be that hot civil war, because what I just laid out, when you have that big violence in the streets, is you have a lot of young people, you have a lot of people who have no economic advantage, you have a lot of oppressed people at levels that Americans don't. There are oppressed people, there are people with economic disadvantages in America, there are systemic problems, as we've talked about. At the level of Egypt, not quite. And so what is more likely to happen is what you see in Iran, which is like with the Green Revolution, is a color revolution, which we somewhat had this summer, where hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets to protest one thing or another and injustices, and it puts pressure on the political system to change. But our system is still so well preserved that you're not going to have a violent overthrow of anything. It's only a color revolution. So for all you collapsitarians, I have bad news for you. So Harry, continue your thought, but I thought that was an interesting conversation that people ought to listen to if they found your point particularly fascinating.
Right. Yeah. The idea of that's happening anytime soon. No, that's No. Can it happen? Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. We can also be wrong, but hopefully we're not. I hope people, understand that, uh, is this the most important election of our lifetime? It's just people changing hands. It's the peaceful power transition that needs to happen, that needs to continue to happen for, to give any semblance of legitimacy to the government, which little that it does have left. Um, the but I think I always want to touch back on one thing that Chris has said is the Libertarian Party has been the canary in the coal mine, and I think and it's also helped spark something in the left, that understanding that the newer Democrats and the newer Republicans are realizing like these old parties of old do not satisfy them. They do not give them what they need, and hopefully tear these things down and break things apart. I think the Democratic Party did a disservice when they were trying to go after the illegitimacy of Trump's election, of trying like electoral college is wrong. We need to do this. And I was like, okay, cool. Let's talk about this and how we can also get other parties out of these two corporations to start, to be able to get on the ballots and have different and stop the voter suppression. It's this perfect storm that they have created that is that this newer crop of people are starting to understand that they don't have to be a Democrat or Republican. It could be something else, and that's also okay, and they started it by trying to delegitimize the other side.
Yeah. Rhinehold?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about how Biden's not going to be the left, the progressives. I mean, that's held true in the last one too. Everybody thought Obama was going to be this hardcore socialist, come in there and do all this stuff, and he actually was better on things like gun control than Trump is. I mean, and he was bombing people and doing all the things that most associated with the right. So
that's the third way strategy. I mean, that Clinton really identified as like, his first 2 years, Dick Morris was poll testing everything, and Clinton would do all these crazy leftist things, and he turned a lot of people off, and then he ditched him and started doing things like welfare reform and moving towards the right. And I heard Mitch Daniels say that a Democratic president is the only one that can take on the debt, that a Republican president can't do it. And it's because you need to have that in-group person like a Biden take on the debt to work with the Republicans to cut a deal, because one team can't do it on their own. So if a leftist president moves right and works on right issues, it's more effective than these doing left stuff like Obamacare. It's like it's delegitimized because it's only one side. The whole system is about balance. Mm-hmm. And Roe versus Wade is controversial because they pushed it too far too soon, unlike gay marriage, which they chipped away at. And then finally it's a settled issue. It's not controversial anymore, except in the fringe.
Right. And when you're talking about the debt, if you look back, it's been the Democratic presidents who have tried to get some sort of sense of the debt under control in the past, like Clinton. And then you look at what Trump did, Bush and Trump. Now, Bush had extenuating circumstances, but then he also put us into a war we didn't need to be into, right, and made it last forever so he could get a bunch of money for the military industrial complex and all that stuff, and Raytheon and whatnot. But that's part of it, is that you need to have, you can't just be scared that the person coming in is going to start running way to the left, because they won't stay in power very long to do that.
Politicians, they want
most of the people in Congress are going to be representing the middle, because those people who are going to Congress are going to be consensus winners. They're going to be representing more of the middle of their communities. So you trying to say that one side or the other in our political system is ever going to just come in and take over, I just don't see that ever happening. It's never really happened before. Right. I mean, you look at Nixon. Nixon was one of the worst presidents before the current one. But he was governing like a Democrat.
Oh my God. Yeah. EPA, and he created
national. We had national speed limit laws because of that. We had
the HMO Act that basically broke healthcare, was Nixon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was trying to legislate what temperature you could set your air conditioner to.
Yeah, was drinking age, was that him too? I think
so. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's the thing is like if you want to, in a system built on balance, you have to get the middle. So Trump's problem is, for instance, let's illustrate it by insulting everybody who isn't a Republican white male boomer and turning off black women, Hispanic men, everybody who isn't in his base. He's lost all those people in the middle. And he thinks, oh, I've got 39% of the population, I can win. No. And so politicians, because, the founders talked a lot about controlling a person's ambition with these factions, right? So if you want to get reelected, the path to power is through compromise and balance and moving towards the other side to get the independent and looking independent. So that's how the system works. And so, now, is that good in terms of liberty? No, not usually. I mean, look at where we're at in terms of the federal government. But it's something that libertarians have to think about because this is the system that you're in and what you have to manage. So
libertarians think that they're going to have that big revolution and just take over everything. And it's not how that works at all. It's just not going to be the way our system allows that change. Look at what the socialists did when they kind of started taking over in the progressive movement in the Democratic Party. That was decades that they worked and chipped and chipped and chipped and get a little bit more and get a little bit more into the platform, right? And libertarians think that they're going to win and just overnight shut the government down. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Go and study Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party from 110 years ago. That is our model. You from the outside put pressure on the other side, moving your cohort to your side, pressuring the other party to on the issues that they agree with, push them, and you read the 1912 Socialist Party platform and it's Barack Obama. It took them 100 years to get there. We as libertarians have to set the agenda for 2100 and start working for it and stop thinking so much about 2020 and this election and being nearsighted, because the Republicans are gone. Like all they care about is the next election and winning, and they don't care about the policy. So whatever libertarian streaks you think existed in the Republican Party, everything about this show says they know they're generationally not going to exist, and they're fighting for whatever scraps they can. They're desperate, and desperation and leadership don't mix.
Right. Yeah.
Imagine what happens if the Republican Party starts to realize that they're getting completely swamped under by what's going on with Trump, and they're not going to have power for the foreseeable future. And then all the people in the Republican Party who are supposedly liberty minded, if they were just say, we're leaving and going to the Libertarian Party. Now, that may be a few years of Democrats being kind of in charge, but then you've got two second parties that are fighting it out over what's going to end up being that counter to the Democrats. Is it going to be the Republicans rebuilding themselves, or is it going to be the Libertarians who finally rise up and become that second party? We'll see.
I've got people messaging me that I was in the Tea Party with 10 years ago going, hey, I'm really sorry for how I treated you 10 years ago. I was a hardcore Republican, and now I see the benefits of having a third party to vote for as a protest. But the truth is, here in Indiana, we are a second party. And it just took one poll for a match to light for Don Rainwater to get all of those libertarian-leaning Republicans to switch sides. It took Donald Trump for a lot of those libertarian-leaning Democrats to switch sides. Like, it just takes the absolute decrepitude of one of the two parties and the conditions for the conditions to be right for these people to swarm into your party. The problem is trying to get all these coalitions to exist. How do you get the Yang Gang and the Tulsi Heads, and I don't know what their nickname is, but going with it, to coexist with the Ron Paulites and the Mises crowd, right? Like, Justin Amash has kind of figured out a way and as a template for coexistence within the movement to build that third way amongst Democrats and Republicans, and hey, if you're not on board with it, you're going to get left behind. Like, when you look at Amash and you look at how he handles Ariana Presley and AOC and then also Thomas Massey and Matt Gaetz. Justin Amash is the template, you know, and the flame throwing, bomb throwing bullshit is not. And if you are, and you're part of the problem at that point, and so be part of the solution or be part of the problem, because you're going to get left behind. That there is no value in trying to replicate the messaging and strategies and temperament and attitude of the least popular president in American history. Like, it just doesn't work for you.
Yeah, look at what happened to all the liberty Republicans, liberty conservatives elected in Congress. The minute that Amash decided that he was done with the Republican Party and he couldn't do it anymore, they turned on him so hard. People who were, I mean, Amash had like the highest rating, and then for freedom on the Freedom Index, and all these people who are just, you know, nowhere near his level were calling him a liberal Democrat and all kinds of. I mean, it was insane what they did, and they do it because they're trying to protect the party, because they know that if those dominoes start to fall, and let's say Massey says I'm done and he goes, and then Rand says I'm done and I go, you know, what happens to their party at that point? They don't have any fake representation of liberty in their party anymore. It's not, It's never been real in the Republican Party, because the Republican Party always looks at those people as being crazies. Like, they're just the crazies, but they'll take advantage of those people and their fundraising. And look what Trump is doing already. Trump is trying to say, hey, look, libertarians, Rand Paul is telling you, I'm going to do this for you. He doesn't care about libertarians or anything the Libertarian Party stands for. He wants those votes. He's going to use Rand Paul to try to get libertarians to vote for him. And that's the only value that liberty people in the conservative movement have for that.
So he can then drag you to a place of utter shame, like Bart Gellman said.